You don't pray when the snow turns red. You just count your bullets. Trapped at the bottom of a frozen ravine, shredded by heavy crossfire, 8 men prepared to die in the dark. Their comms were dead. The world had forgotten them. Then, beneath the gunfire, a radio clicked. Snow didn't fall. It drove hard, moving sideways across the valley floor like white static on a dead screen. Dwayne Corliss pressed his cheek against the frozen granite of the outcropping. Every time he inhaled, the air scraped down his throat, raw and metallic. He didn't need to look at his shoulder to know he was bleeding out. The thick, sluggish warmth spreading beneath his tactical rig told him enough. Around him, the remnants of his squad were embedded in the snow-choked ravine, returning fire not to win, but just to buy another 60 seconds of breathing. 50 yards up the ridge, the tree line flashed with muzzle flares. The reports were muffled by the dense snowfall, turning the sharp crack of incoming rounds into heavy, rhythmic thuds. 2 more moving left, Charles Bennett shouted over the din. Bennett was 10 feet away, wedged beneath the roots of an overturned pine. His face was a mask of soot and frostbite. He racked the bolt of his rifle, the metal clacking sluggishly in the sub-zero temperature. He fired once. A shadow in the trees staggered, then dropped. "That's one," Bennett muttered, his voice devoid of triumph. Just a counting. They had been in the valley for 4 hours. It felt like 4 decades. The ambush had been perfectly executed. Corliss and his men had walked right into a horseshoe formation of entrenched mercenaries. Heavy caliber fire had ripped through their point man before they even registered the threat. Since then, it had been a slow, methodical constriction. The enemy wasn't rushing. They didn't need to. The cold was doing half their work for them. Corliss checked his magazine. 4 rounds. He looked down the line. Miller was applying a second tourniquet to his leg, his lips blue, eyes glassy with shock. Jackson was dead, slumped over his weapon, the snow slowly burying him. They were cut off. The satellite comms were jammed, and the shortwave radios had been shattered in the opening volley. Corliss swallowed hard. He was a pragmatic man, 38 years old, 15 of them spent deploying to the worst corners of the globe. He knew the math of a gunfight better than anyone. They had the low ground. They were outgunned 10-1. They had no heavy support, no air cover, and no extraction. He leaned his head back against the rock. The cynical part of his brain, the part that kept him alive this long, told him it was over. He ran a thumb over the fire selector of his rifle, switching it from semi to full auto. If they were going to get overrun, he was going to empty the magazine into the first shape that crested the ridge. Then a sound cut through the auditory sludge of wind and gunfire. It was impossibly faint. A short burst of static in the earpiece he still wore, the one tethered to a damaged comms unit tucked in his chest rig. Click, click. Corliss froze. He squeezed his eyes shut, concentrating all his remaining energy on his right ear. The wind howled, a bitter, empty sound. He waited. 10 seconds, 20. Click, click, pause, click. 2 short, 1 long. It was a manual squelch break, an old analog signal cutting through the digital jamming by operating on a localized, low-tier frequency. Bennett slid down the embankment, snow cascading over his shoulders. He bumped into Corliss, panting hard, his breath pluming in the grey air. "They're shifting the PKM," Bennett rasped, his voice hoarse. "They've got an angle on Miller. If they open up, he's gone. We have to move." Corliss didn't answer. He was staring past Bennett, looking up at the jagged, snow-blinded peak to the north. "Hey!" Bennett snapped, shaking Corliss's uninjured shoulder. "Boss, did you hear me? We have to move." "Hold," Corliss whispered. "Hold? Hold where?" "We're in a grave, Dwayne. They're just throwing the dirt in. Bennett's eyes were wide, the whites stark against his blackened skin. Panic wasn't something Bennett did, but reality was setting in. Corliss looked at his second-in-command. He saw the exhaustion, the absolute certainty of death. He reached up, his bloody gloved hand gripping Bennett's rig. "She's coming," Corliss whispered. Bennett stared at him, uncomprehending. Then a dark realization seemed to wash over his face. He thought Corliss was hallucinating. Blood loss, delirium. Hayes was on the second helo, Bennett said slowly, speaking to Corliss like a child. "The second helo went down in the gorge, Dwayne, 3 miles away. Even if she survived the crash, she's not coming. Nobody's coming." "I heard the clicks," Corliss said, his voice steadying, gripping the reality of the sound. "Two short, one long." "It's just static," Bennett argued, pulling away to peer over the rock. "It's the cold messing with the circuitry." "She's coming," Corliss repeated it, not as a hope, as a fact. Above them, the enemy heavy machine gun roared to life. The snow around Miller erupted in geysers of white and brown earth. Miller screamed, dragging himself backward, leaving a thick red smear across the ice. Corliss didn't look at Miller. He kept his eyes on the northern ridge. The wind whipped the snow into a frenzy, obscuring everything beyond 100 yards. He knew Riley Hayes. He knew what she was built for. She wasn't just a Navy SEAL, she was a quiet, relentless force of nature. She didn't possess loud bravado. She didn't boast in the barracks. She was a woman who calculated variables, internalized pain, and executed violence with terrifying precision. If she was alive, she was moving. And if she was moving, she was hunting. Riley Hayes tasted copper. She spat into the snow, watching the red droplet vanish instantly into the endless white. Her left side was a canvas of bruised ribs, a parting gift from the hard landing when the Black Hawk's tail rotor clipped the canyon wall. That was 3 hours ago, or maybe 4. Time was losing its structure, stretching and compressing with the rhythm of her breathing. She was trudging through waist-deep drifts, dragging 70 pounds of gear up a 70-degree incline. Every step was a negotiation with her own biology. Her quadriceps burned, screaming for oxygen. Her fingers, double-gloved inside thick winter mittens, felt like thick wooden dowels. Step. Drag the rear leg. Breathe. She paused, leaning her forehead against the rough, frozen bark of a spruce tree. She closed her eyes. The pain was just data. It was information her brain was receiving, and she consciously chose to file it away. She brought her wrist up to her face, hitting the illumination button on her GPS. The screen flickered, the liquid crystals sluggish in the negative 20-degree cold. The digital map showed her 1 kilometer from the rally point, but she already knew Corliss and the team weren't at the rally point. 10 minutes ago, the wind had shifted, carrying the unmistakable, flat thud-thud-thud of heavy gunfire. Not a skirmish, a sustained engagement. Riley didn't run. Running in deep snow was a fool's errand. It spiked the heart rate, generated sweat that would later freeze, and drained energy reserves that couldn't be replenished. She moved methodically, a steady, unbroken rhythm. A predator's pace. She reached the crest of the ridge. Below her, the valley opened up like a ragged wound in the earth. The snowfall was dense, but she had an overwatch position. She dropped to her stomach, ignoring the shock of the ice against her chest, and pulled the thermal monocular from her webbing. She powered it on. The screen bloomed in shades of grey and white. Instantly, the battlefield organized itself. Down in the ditch, huddled tightly against the rocks, she saw 5 faint heat signatures. Corliss's team. They were cold, their body heat dissipating. Higher up, spread out in a wide, sweeping arc, were the hunters. Riley swept the monocular across the enemy line. She counted them. 12, 14, 18 distinct heat signatures. They were well spaced, utilizing cover, keeping up a disciplined rate of fire. This wasn't a ragtag militia. These were professionals. She focused on the back of the enemy line. There, perched on an elevated shelf of rock overlooking the entire valley, was a single, stationary signature. The sniper, the overwatch. He was keeping Corliss and the boys pinned, dictating the flow of the battle from his perch. Riley lowered the optic. She blinked the snow from her eyelashes. She was one person. She had a suppressed Mk-12 rifle, 3 spare magazines, a sidearm, 2 fragmentation grenades, and a combat knife. Engaging 18 men head-on was suicide. She didn't need to kill 18 men. She just needed to break the machine. A military unit is a machine. It relies on communication, hierarchy, and momentum. Right now, the enemy had all the momentum. They were comfortable. They were shooting fish in a barrel. Riley needed to make them uncomfortable. She needed to introduce chaos. She unclipped the heavy winter mittens, letting them hang from their idiot cords around her wrists. She slipped her hands into her thinner, tactile shooting gloves. The cold bit into her knuckles immediately, a sharp, stinging rebuke. She ignored it. She low-crawled along the ridge, moving laterally. She wasn't heading down into the valley to join Corliss in the grave. She was flanking the enemy overwatch. The snow was her ally now. It muffled the crunch of her boots, hid her approach. She moved from tree to tree, a grey phantom drifting through the blizzard. At 200 yards, she found her angle. She settled in behind the rotting stump of an old oak. She deployed the bipod of her Mark 12, sinking the legs deep into the snow for stability. She nestled the stock into her shoulder, resting her cheek against the cold polymer. She dialed the magnification on her scope. Through the glass, the enemy sniper came into sharp focus. He was dressed in a heavy white snowsuit, completely camouflaged to the naked eye. He was lying prone, his eye glued to his own optic, entirely focused on the killing floor below. He was so confident in his rear security that he hadn't even placed tripwires. Riley controlled her breathing. Inhale, exhale. The crosshairs settled on the space just behind the man's ear, where the hood of his snowsuit met his collar. She waited for the wind to howl, for the heavy machine gun down below to rattle. She needed the noise to mask the mechanical snap of her bolt. Thud, 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 thud. Riley squeezed the trigger. The suppressed rifle coughed, a muffled, unassuming crack. 200 yards away, the sniper went entirely limp. His head slumped forward onto his rifle chassis. He didn't thrash. He just stopped moving. Riley didn't admire the shot. She immediately transitioned. She shifted the rifle left, finding the spotter who was crouched 5 yards away from the sniper, scanning the valley with binoculars. The spotter turned, noticing his partner's sudden lack of movement. He reached out a hand. Riley fired again. The spotter dropped, clutching his throat, collapsing backward into the snowdrift. 2 down, the eyes of the enemy machine were blind. Riley collapsed the bipod, rose to a crouch, and began moving rapidly down the slope, cutting directly behind the enemy's main line. She moved with a sudden, fluid aggression. The slow, methodical trek was over. Now it was about speed and violence of action. Down in the valley, the heavy machine gun paused its firing cycle. The enemy commander was likely barking on the radio, asking the sniper for a sit rep. He would get only static. Confusion was setting in. Riley slipped behind a massive boulder, less than 40 yards from the rear of the enemy's left flank. 3 mercenaries were huddled there, reloading their weapons, entirely unaware that the perimeter behind them had just collapsed. She pulled a fragmentation grenade from her rig. She pulled the pin, the metal ring cold against her palm. She didn't throw it immediately. She held the spoon down, counting the seconds in her head, calculating the distance. She wanted the explosion to be an announcement. Down in the ditch, Corliss heard the sudden, strange lull in the enemy fire. He looked at Bennett. Bennett was frowning, his rifle still raised, confused by the sudden drop in pressure. "What are they doing?" Bennett hissed. Corliss didn't answer. He just tightened his grip on his rifle. The cynical knot in his stomach was beginning to loosen, replaced by a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline. Up on the ridge behind the enemy line, Riley Hayes let the spoon fly. She tossed the grenade high, a perfect arc over the boulder, dropping it right into the center of the three mercenaries. It detonated before it even hit the snow. The blast was not a fiery cinematic eruption. It was a vicious, flat crump that tore the air in half. A shockwave of displaced snow, shredded pine needles, and fragmented steel violently cleared a 10-foot radius on the ridge. The three mercenaries were instantly silenced, thrown into the surrounding drifts like discarded rags. A thick, dark mist hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the blizzard swallowed it whole. Riley didn't stay to admire the devastation. She was already moving. The moment the grenade left her hand, she had pivoted, driving her frozen boots into the powder, sliding down a slight depression that ran parallel to the enemy line. She was a ghost operating in the margins of their panic. Down in the kill box, the world shifted. The relentless drumming pressure of the heavy machine gun abruptly ceased. The deafening roar of the ambush fractured into disjointed, confused shouting from the tree line. Corliss felt the change in his marrow. It wasn't just a lull in the fighting, it was a fundamental shift in atmospheric pressure. The hunters had just realized there was a wolf in the blind with them. "Bennett!" Corliss roared, his voice tearing through his raw throat. "Suppressive fire! Up the middle! Give her noise!" Bennett didn't hesitate. He didn't ask how Corliss knew or what the plan was. He just drove his shoulder into the dirt, braced his rifle against a frozen root, and held the trigger down. The remaining able-bodied men in the ditch, Garrett and Hayes's teammate, a quiet kid named Thompson, joined in. They fired blindly into the tree line, dumping their remaining magazines, creating a wall of deafening, chaotic noise. They weren't trying to hit anything. They were providing a blanket of auditory cover. Up on the ridge, the enemy commander, a thick-necked brute named Sutter, was screaming into a handheld radio. His voice cracked with a mixture of rage and sudden, creeping dread. His left flank was gone. His overwatch was dead. And now, the men they had trapped in the valley were fighting back with the ferocity of the damned. "Left side!" Sutter bellowed, waving a hand toward the cratered snow where the grenade had detonated. "Collapse the line! Turn the PKM around! Find them!" The mercenaries were professionals, but they were human. The blizzard was blinding them, and the sudden, violent death of their comrades had shattered their confidence. They turned their weapons away from the valley, sweeping their barrels frantically across the empty white woods behind them. They were looking for a squad. They were looking for an organized assault force. They weren't looking for one woman prone in the roots of a dead cedar. Riley exhaled, watching a cluster of 4 mercenaries push cautiously toward the blast radius. They were bunched up, poor discipline born of fear. She rested the crosshairs of her Mark 12 on the trailing man's chest. Crack! The man dropped, a sudden heavy weight pulling him straight down into the snow. The other 3 spun, raising their rifles, firing wildly into the trees. Bark exploded. Snow rained down in heavy clumps. Riley had already rolled 3 feet to her right, pressing herself flat against the frozen earth. She let them fire, let them waste their ammunition, and reveal their exact positions in the muzzle flashes. When their rifles clicked empty, she rose to a knee. Crack, crack, 2 more fell. The last man screamed, a high, panicked sound, and turned to run back toward the heavy machine gun nest. He didn't make it 3 steps. Riley's final round caught him in the back of the knee, sending him pitching forward into a snowbank. She dropped the empty magazine into the snow. She didn't have time to retain it. She slapped a fresh one into the mag well, slapped the bolt catch, and kept moving. The mechanical precision of her assault was breaking the enemy's spirit. A mercenary fights for a paycheck. When the math of survival shifts too drastically, the paycheck loses its value. Several men on the right flank saw the left side crumble and began backing away, fading into the tree line, abandoning the contract for their lives. But Sutter wasn't running. He was entrenched behind a wall of sandbags and frozen mud, manning the PKM machine gun with his loader. Riley checked her weapon. 6 rounds left in the rifle. A full magazine in her sidearm. She looked down the slope. The machine gun nest was 50 yards away, situated on a rocky outcropping that gave it a commanding view of both the valley below and the ridge above. Sutter had pivoted the heavy weapon. He was no longer aiming at Corliss. He was aiming at the woods, aiming at her. "Come on out!" Sutter screamed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. He racked the charging handle of the PKM, the heavy metallic clank sounding like a death knell in the cold air. "I see you, you ghosts! Come on!" He didn't see her, but he knew she was there. Riley crouched behind a boulder. She couldn't flank him. The terrain funneled directly into his line of sight. If she stepped out, the heavy 7.62 rounds would tear her apart before she took a single breath. She needed a distraction. Down in the valley, Corliss was out of ammunition. His rifle clicked dry. He dropped it, pulling his sidearm. His shoulder was throbbing, a deep, sickening pulse that threatened to pull him into unconsciousness. He looked at Bennett. Bennett's rifle was empty too. The silence in the valley was heavy, pregnant with violence. "They stopped firing," Bennett whispered, his breath shallow. "They're turning the gun on her," Corliss said. The realization was a cold stone in his stomach. Riley had taken the pressure off them, but in doing so, she had drawn the entirety of the enemy's wrath. Corliss looked at the jagged slope leading up to the machine gun nest. It was 70 yards of open, snow-covered ground. Suicide. He pushed himself up off the frozen rock. "What are you doing?" Bennett hissed, grabbing Corliss's combat belt. "We don't let her fight alone," Corliss said. His voice was ragged, barely a croak, but the command was absolute. "Fix bayonets, draw knives, whatever you have. We move on the gun." Bennett stared at him. It was madness. It was a tactical absurdity. Bennett drew his combat knife. The dull grey steel caught the ambient light of the storm. "I always hated this valley anyway." Corliss stepped out from behind the rock. "Hey!" Corliss screamed, his voice tearing, echoing up the mountain. He fired 3 rounds from his pistol into the air. "Hey! Look down here!" Up in the nest, Sutter flinched. He swung the heavy barrel of the PKM back toward the valley, his eyes widening as he saw the bloodied, broken remnants of the SEAL team staggering out of their cover, charging up the hill. "Fools!" Sutter spat. He gripped the spade grips of the machine gun, ready to cut them down. It was the mistake Riley had been waiting for. The second Sutter shifted the barrel of the PKM downward, Riley broke from cover. She didn't run like a soldier on a parade ground. She practically fell down the slope, using gravity and the deep snow to propel her forward at a reckless, terrifying speed. She closed the 50 yards in seconds, a blur of grey and white crashing through the underbrush. Sutter's loader heard the crunch of snow. He spun around, raising his assault rifle. Riley didn't bother bringing the long barrel of the Mark 12 to bear. She let it drop on its sling, drawing her Sig Sauer pistol in a single, fluid motion. She fired twice from the hip. Both rounds caught the loader in the chest, dropping him instantly over the sandbags. Sutter heard the shots. He let go of the machine gun and spun, drawing a heavy fixed-blade knife from his chest rig. Riley hit the sandbag wall with her knees, using her momentum to vault over the barricade. She crashed directly into Sutter. The impact knocked them both into the freezing mud at the bottom of the trench. The pistol flew from Riley's grip, skittering away into the darkness. It was no longer a gunfight. It was a brawl in a frozen grave. Sutter was massive, fueled by adrenaline and rage. He shoved Riley off him, bringing the heavy knife down in a brutal hacking arc. Riley rolled, the blade sinking deep into the frozen earth where her neck had been a fraction of a second before. She scrambled to her knees, drawing her own blade, a compact, serrated combat knife. Sutter ripped his knife from the dirt and lunged. He didn't use technique. He used sheer, overwhelming force. He crashed into her, pinning her against the rough stone wall of the outcropping. His left hand wrapped around her throat, squeezing with crushing pressure, while his right hand drove the knife toward her ribs. Riley didn't panic. Panic was a waste of oxygen. She caught his knife wrist with her left hand, her frozen fingers digging into his thick winter coat, desperately holding the blade inches from her chest. Her arm trembled under his weight. He was too strong. The blade inched closer, tearing through the outer layer of her tactical jacket. She couldn't overpower him. She had to dismantle him. Instead of pushing against his immense weight, Riley suddenly dropped her hips, yielding to his forward momentum. Sutter stumbled forward, his balance broken. In that split second of weightlessness, Riley brought her right hand up, driving the pommel of her knife viciously into Sutter's orbital bone. Bone crunched. Sutter roared in agony, his grip on her throat loosening. Riley didn't hesitate. She reversed her grip on the handle and drove the blade upward, sinking it deep into the soft tissue beneath Sutter's jawline, angling it up toward the cranial cavity. Sutter's eyes went wide. The rage drained from them, replaced by a sudden, vacant shock. He staggered backward, his hands grasping uselessly at his neck. He took one step, two, and then collapsed over the sandbags, tumbling down the snowy embankment. Riley slumped against the stone wall. Her chest heaved, pulling in jagged, burning breaths of freezing air. Her vision swam at the edges, darkening into static. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling, covered in a mixture of dirt, snow, and blood. The woods were suddenly terrifyingly quiet. The blizzard howled, but the gunfire had ceased completely. She forced herself to stand. Her left leg nearly gave out, the bruised muscles screaming in protest. She leaned against the sandbags, looking down into the valley. Footsteps crunched in the snow, slow, deliberate. Riley snatched up the loader's dropped assault rifle, pivoting unsteadily to face the noise. 3 figures emerged from the whiteout, staggering up the slope. They were covered in soot, their uniforms torn, moving with the slow, agonizing gait of men who had accepted death but were forced to keep walking. At the front was Dwayne Corliss. His right arm was entirely soaked in dark, freezing blood. He looked up at the machine gun nest. He saw the bodies of the mercenaries, and he saw Riley leaning over the sandbags, a stolen rifle in her trembling hands. Corliss stopped. He lowered his pistol. Bennett stepped up beside him, panting heavily, his eyes wide as he took in the carnage around the trench. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The wind whipped between them, carrying the metallic scent of blood and expended brass. Riley lowered the rifle. She reached up, slowly pulling the thick tactical gaiter down from her face. Her lips were cracked, her cheeks smeared with mud and Sutter's blood. She looked at Corliss, taking in his shattered shoulder, the exhausted slump of his posture. "You look like hell, boss," Riley said. Her voice was raspy, barely a whisper over the wind. Corliss let out a breath that was half laugh, half cough. The tension that had been holding his spine together finally snapped, and he slumped back against a pine tree, sliding slowly down to the snow. Bennett walked forward, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. He looked at the dead commander, then at the empty woods, and finally at Riley. "I told him," Bennett muttered, a faint, exhausted smile breaking through the grime on his face. "I told him it was just static." Riley reached into her chest rig, her numb fingers fumbling with the pouch. She pulled out the cracked, damaged comms unit. She held it up, tapping the transmission button. Click, click, pause, click. The sound was tiny, swallowed instantly by the vast, indifferent storm. Corliss closed his eyes, resting his head against the frozen bark. The killing box was broken. The ambush was over. He listened to the wind, feeling the freezing air fill his lungs, and for the first time in 4 hours, he knew they were going to live. Blood frozen to a cracked radio casing isn't romantic, but sometimes it's the only thing that guides the ghosts home. Did this gritty, deeply human story of survival and absolute resilience keep you on the edge of your seat? The bond between these operators and Riley's relentless fight against the odds is exactly what we love bringing to life. If you want more intense, character-driven military dramas that show rather than just tell, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next tactical storytelling experience.